Alrighty. Just gonna make sure everyone can hear me. Can everyone hear me? Are we A+? Fantastic. Alright, hello! Welcome. Thank you for joining me so early in the morning. You heard a bunch of stuff about me already. A couple additional things. I run a little website called DevToast where I have a lot of tutorials and I'm publishing more and more as days go by to help developers level up some more. I run a little company called Rapid Supply that hook people up with some sweet developer pins. And I'm also an Emma Watson enthusiast. She's amazing. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Cool. So today we'll be talking about the evolution and future of content publishing. So let's get started. We have to sort of take a step back and talk about the ye old web. Some time ago, Tim Berners-Lee, this little fella here, who worked at a nuclear research facility in 1980, developed something called hypertext. And the purpose for hypertext was to allow researchers to share their writings and their publications with each other as easily as possible. Because it was super complex. Everything was done with printed content and was very troublesome. So he created a way to have these people share this content through this thing called the internet. And hypertext was what he was going to create as a standard to do so. It later evolved into a much more proper standard, which was released as the first version of HTML. And HTML was incredible. It was simple, it was flexible, it was forgiving, and it grew pretty fast. And not everyone believed that, though. They were like, yeah, right. This thing's going to change the world. We'll see about that. And people were making fun of cyberspace and the internet because they didn't believe this was actually going to take on. Obviously it did. It grew exponentially and caused things like FITC to exist. We're all here to learn more about the web and the content that exists on the web. So HTML and all of these publications now allowed these researchers to share and collaborate and spread their information across a wide range of people. Now, things weren't perfect, though. There were requirements that consumers had that didn't fit in this model very well. And the majority of consumers at this point in time were still very big companies like IBM and AOL and all these companies who had tons and tons of money, huge infrastructure, and they felt that there were a bunch of limitations that existed for this platform that was just HTML at this point. It was manual, it was a little bit slow, and there wasn't a lot of comfort with the tooling. You had to actually dive into code and write HTML yourself. And obviously, like some of the bigger players in the industry, they were like, we don't want to do that. We don't have time for that. We want there to be a faster, more intuitive way of doing this. So evolution in the web happens for two reasons. One, when there's a limitation that exists with what currently exists, and when there's an ability or possibilities that exist with new tech that gets released, or there's new features that would allow someone to build something that would solve these limitations and help make things a little bit easier. So people ask themselves, all right, so we've got a whole bunch of content that we need to manage somehow, so let's create systems that allow us to do that. See what I did? See? Yeah, okay, cool. So the first one that was created was by a company called AOL in 1992. They developed something called Rain Man. This was sort of like the first stab at content management systems, but still required a lot of help. It was sort of the content itself could be managed by writers and publishers, but a lot of the stuff still needed to be supported by developers. And this was still very big scale, very corporate. There was another company called FileNet that was later acquired by IBM. They were also creating something similar to this. And soon after, because this stuff was still very much enterprise focused, a lot of people realized that, hey, this stuff is awesome, but we need to make this more usable and more consumer facing and less focused on large enterprise companies. So things like PHP Nuke and Blogger and Zend, a whole bunch of these other platforms started to emerge in the early 90s. And then 2003 hit, and this one company took the world by storm and released something called WordPress. And WordPress was crazy. WordPress allowed for unlimited customization. You could do anything you possibly wanted. And the one thing that made it stand out from all of its competitors was that it allowed for third-party developers to create extensions. Its plugin ecosystem grew out of control. It was absolutely incredible. And it launched what I call the CMS explosion. It was at that point when companies realized the power and the capabilities of what CMSs could do and the requirement that the industry had for them. Soon after came Joomla, soon after came Drupal, and then of course we can't forget our favorite one, MySpace, and a whole bunch of other CMSs that immediately began to pop up after these original few. So I quickly popped over to Wikipedia to see if there was a list or aggregated list of CMSs that exist. And it's not a full list, but if you just scroll through, there's hundreds and hundreds of CMS that are currently listed on the Wikipedia page. And this is still nowhere near a full list of all of those. There's a whole bunch that I've used in the past that aren't included on this list. And new ones are emerging every single week, sort of like how the JS world exists right now as well. Slowly but surely, a new focus developed. Those CMSs that we had were fantastic, they were solving awesome problems, but we wanted something that was even simpler. We needed something that was more intuitive, and we needed something that was extremely easy to use. Because the ones that existed, like WordPress and all of those, were fantastic, but still required a lot of setup, it required a lot of server configuration to deploy, so we needed something even simpler. And one company in particular did an incredible job to build a platform that allowed them to do this really, really well. And that was a company called Squarespace. Squarespace took over the market incredibly fast. It grew so fast. They had amazing marketing systems as well. They allowed users to drag and drop things and write content right in their browser. There was no back end and front end. Everything was just in this one magical place that was instantly visual, and they could see exactly what they needed to do. It would do live resizing of content images and video. You could embed all sorts of crazy stuff right off the bat without needing anything additional, without the need of plugins. So Squarespace and a bunch of these other things or other CMSs that came out during this time were incredible. So many people who were apprehensive to dive into the world of web and have a web presence immediately realized that, oh, hey, this is super easy. They felt extremely empowered. They were like, oh, this is absolutely fantastic. We can totally do what we need to do, and it's so much simpler than we originally thought. So the state of today-ish is that there's tons and tons of options. There's hundreds and hundreds of CMSs that exist today. But there's still a few concerns and limitations that exist. One is performance. With the continuous growth of all of these features and different CMSs and their tooling, performance wasn't really given that much of an attention. Everyone was focused purely on creating new features and new tools and new CMSs and new interactive methodologies within these CMSs. No one was focusing on performance as much as they should have. And the performance, unfortunately, with a lot of these content management systems isn't the best. They continue to improve, and there's plugins and tools that exist that allow you to improve this. So for WordPress, you've got caching tools, you've got a whole bunch of other plugins that you can use to speed up the initial load of your WordPress websites. A lot of specific hosting services decided to focus on these specific platforms as well. There's entire hosting companies dedicated just to WordPress, and they've tweaked and completely customized their hosting environments to be very, very specific for WordPress. So a lot of companies have done tons and tons of work to sort of band-aid the solution, band-aid these like performance issues, but like the tools themselves are continuously having this battle between the features that they're needing to create and release with the performance that they need as well. A lot of the fancier CMSs like Squarespace and Wix unfortunately have to rely on really, really complicated and kind of gross techniques to create the layouts that they need to do while creating this really flexible environment for like the users themselves to build this content. There's tons of really gross table use, there's tons of really weird positioning. It gets really gross, really, really fast. And the markup gets kind of disgusting as well, depending on the layout that you're using. And this ends up hindering your performance, and hindering your performance ends up hindering your searchability on Google. And a couple of years ago, Google announced that it was now going to start looking at the website performance speeds as an indicator of where something would show up in your search results as well. So performance was no longer this afterthought. It became super, super, super important. Now, there's this one dude named Tom Preston Werner. He's the co-founder of GitHub. And he realized that the fastest option for content, regardless of all the CMSs that exist in the world, was still static HTML. He realized the static HTML is still the fastest option. Nothing can beat serving just static HTML. So he took a slightly different direction. He wanted to explore and like try something different. And he created what was called Jekyll. And Jekyll was very different. It wasn't really a CMS. It was more so a site generator. And what Jekyll allowed you to do was take Markdown, which is sort of like an easier way to write your content, which then gets converted into HTML, along with something called front matter, which is sort of like your very, very visual, very easy to write data that you would require for your content, for dynamic stuff. And a templating language called Liquid that was developed by Shopify. So he took all of these three things and added in the ability to create custom post types. So you've got your posts, you've got authors, you've got books, like all these additional custom posts that you would need, along with a small library of plugins based in Ruby, and created a Ruby compiler that would take all of this content that you've written using Markdown. It takes that data that you've created using front matter and inserts them where it needs to using liquid templating, and compiles all of that down to static HTML. And my own website is built using Jekyll. I wanted to see what it was like a few years ago, and it was extremely, extremely fast and really easy to use. As a developer, it's extremely intuitive. It's very, very simple. Doesn't require much to get started. And I noticed that, so I was using a CMS before this, one of those fancy PHP ones, and even though my website was very simple, I didn't really have much going on. I was just hosting on a regular host. I didn't want to pay too much for a dedicated PHP hosting system. My site load speed was 3.5 to 4 seconds. And I was like, that's ridiculous. Why is it so heavy just for something so simple? And as soon as I switched over to this, my site speed load time went to less than a second. And when you do a repeat hit on my website, for the second time, once a bunch of stuff gets cached, the site load time goes down to 0.4 seconds, which I was I was like, hot damn, all right, that's pretty cool. There are tons and tons of people who realized that this was awesome, that this idea of a site generator was pretty cool. And a whole bunch of people were like, we don't really like the way Jekyll's gone about doing it. Some people didn't like Ruby, some people didn't like Liquid. So hundreds emerged in the next few years that did something very similar. Some used PHP, some used Python, some used JavaScript, server-side JavaScript. There's tons and tons of different options that exist to accomplish the exact same thing. So you're looking at me and you're like, all right, what? Stop. No, what happened to the ease of use? That's super nice and super helpful for developers, but for an end user who was looking at something like Squarespace, Jekyll and all of these site generators aren't the way to go for them. This becomes extremely complex. They don't want to install things through command line. They don't want to have to install compilers to run these tools to compile their content down to static content and then publish. That's not the way we want to go. So there were a bunch of companies and a bunch of tools that were developed and released. And what they essentially ended up doing was creating a CMS layer that exists on top of these static site generators. And one of the first ones that I came across was something called Webhook. Webhook was extremely, extremely interesting. What Webhook does or allows you to do is install the Webhook app on your computer. So it's a very visual interface. So you can install it for Mac or Windows. And then it allows you to, in the browser, create all sorts of different custom post types that you would normally do anywhere else. And it's extremely intuitive. You can just click all the different fields that you would need for that custom post, and you're creating all of these different templates or different content management system layouts that an end user would need, that you would need to provide. And as a developer, this is extremely easy to use and then hand over to whoever your client is. Behind the scenes, it uses something called Swig templates. It's very, very similar to how Liquid works, but it's just a slightly different way of doing so. And this is what some of these Swig templates look like. And one of the awesome things about Webhook and Swig was that it allowed you to do image resizing on the fly as well. So if you notice that image tag, you can pipe the image into a resize function, and it would dynamically, on the fly, before converting all of your content into a static build, would also resize your image content as well, which was pretty sweet. And once again, convert everything into a static website. Now, Webhook is also open source, which is fantastic. So Webhook allows you to self-host the entire platform infrastructure on your own systems. So you can do whatever you want with Webhook and create all sorts of really, really crazy and interesting things. Another similar platform that I absolutely love and I've been using more and more of is something called Siteleaf. Siteleaf just released their new version 2 just a couple of months ago. They're still in beta, and definitely recommend checking it out. They've got developer versions as well, which are for free. Highly recommend checking them out. So their interface is extremely simple to use, really, really beautiful. It starts off with just a title and this main content module, just as you would see on WordPress, for example. But they allow you to add additional custom posts and additional fields that you would require for any custom posts, for pages, for any layouts, and do all sorts of really, really interesting things, and create really dynamic and rich experiences, but still keep things extremely, extremely simple and lightweight. They once again use Liquid, A+. They also use Sass and JavaScript. And one of the awesome things that they ended up doing was created the ability to hook everything up to GitHub. Now, Jekyll, because it was built by the team at GitHub, integrates very, very nicely with GitHub. If anyone's used GitHub pages, those are all primarily built using Jekyll. So now, Siteleaf created this platform that was sitting on top of Jekyll. You can take any website that you've created with Jekyll and immediately convert it into a theme on Siteleaf, which makes my life very easy if I decide to, you know what, I prefer a more intuitive, more visual way to manage my content. I can easily upload my entire theme onto Siteleaf and then begin managing my content through Siteleaf. Being able to have it hosted on GitHub is also fantastic. It allows me to manage my content in 3 particular ways. I can either pull down the repo and actually go into the content and update the markdown that way, or I can just open up that repo on GitHub and push up commits that way, or I can go into the visual interface that Siteleaf now provides me and update the content there. So Siteleaf created this awesome ecosystem where developers and non-developers could easily update content in any way that they wanted, whatever felt comfortable to them. They weren't tied down to having to do it in just one particular way, which was awesome. And in terms of hosting, they had tons and tons of hosting options, whether you want to host on your own platform, GitHub Pages, Rackspace, Amazon S3, a whole bunch of options as well. So with this growth of new frameworks and libraries comes another limitation, which was dev flexibility. People wanted to, build things using not just Liquid and Sass and whatever they want. We wanted to use React. We want to use Angular. We want to create these really, really rich interactive websites, but still have that content in a nice, manageable way. And second, the content was also now required on more than just one platforms. We heard just earlier today that content is now required to be everywhere. We've got websites, we've got mobile apps, we've got devices, we've got interactive media. Content, that same content needs to be published everywhere. And as Jonathan mentioned, we need to start thinking outside the browser. Very appropriate conversation for this morning, A+. So one of the first ways I saw this happen was when I was working at my last agency, TWG. We were quite handy with Ruby on Rails, and normally we would build a CMS, and if we would need to, and then do all of the front-end work using within that same ecosystem as well. But what we started to do was use Ruby on Rails to just create a content API. So you would have a CMS where you would input all of your information and all of your content, but that wasn't displayed anywhere. All that Rails app would provide is an API endpoint with all of your data. And then you could do whatever you want with that. So it gave you the data and allowed for full flexibility to do whatever it is that you wanted. And it created this separation of concern. The data was on one side, and how you chose to represent it was up to you. You were no longer tied down to using that same language or that same ecosystem to create the front end or the consuming side or the front end side of that platform. So a whole bunch of other companies emerged as well to do something similar. Prismic was one of them. Contentful is one of my favorites that does something like this. It's essentially a CMS that just provides API endpoints. It doesn't get published anywhere. There's no themes. There's no templates. It's just really, really nice looking interfaces where you can create your custom posts, add in the required fields that you need, upload all of your content. And what that allows you to do is have these endpoints that you can then call and do all of your GET requests and make API calls to, and pull that data into your own websites and display them wherever and however you like. So hopping back to SiteLeaf, SiteLeaf also offers this. So any of your content that you're publishing on SiteLeaf, they also create a API endpoint. So you can not only have a statically built website as soon as you're done working, you also have a endpoint that you can use to create your mobile apps or create your visual interfaces or stuff for your mobile devices, mobile apps, sorry, or your wearables. WordPress is also realizing that this is extremely, extremely important and are releasing something called the WP REST API. A large chunk of it is already in WordPress core. You can add a plugin that allows you to get the remaining features that you would need to start using WordPress as a CMS, but just for content, and not be required to have to use this particular theme, have to use PHP templating to create your themes and your front end, and just have your content managed through WordPress. Because what WordPress does, and is very, very popular for, is their CMS aspect. It's extremely useful, very intuitive. Tons and tons of people find it extremely comforting. 40% of the internet, or something crazy stat like that, is built on WordPress. Lots and lots of people will specifically request you to build their projects using WordPress because they've seen their backend interface before. They've seen those interfaces and are comfortable with those. So even if something like SiteLeaf may be simpler or more intuitive, they feel more comfortable using WordPress. So WordPress isn't going anywhere anytime soon, regardless of how you feel about it. So with the launch of the REST API plugin and eventually inclusion built right into the WordPress core platform, it's going to be incredible. So you won't even need to install any other plugins. You'll be able to have all of your content sitting in one place and then sort of push that content out to all of these other platforms. Mind is blown. So this speeds up your publishing. You no longer require teams to do your content publishing for this. We have this one team that's doing our publishing work for our website. This is another team that's handling all of our content for our mobile apps. Another team for our large TV displays when you walk into a retail store. Everything is done in one particular place. And that's awesome because all of your content is now consistent as well. You now require less people to manage that content, and all that content is consistent. What it also allows you to do is being aware that that your content is going to be available in that same format. You can just make one call, and you now have all of your data in this one big JSON blob. Your developers understand what that data looks like. It looks the same for all of them, and they can each communicate within the teams to discuss what best approaches they need to where best to pull the data that they need for their particular teams. So the mobile teams are now talking to the web teams and talking to the other publishing teams, and everyone's seeing the exact same data. Any changes being made to that data immediately impacts all of those platforms at the same time. There's no longer specific tie downs like the mobile team has to work with that and the web team has to work with that. Everything is now tied to that one same uniform place for your content. This is extremely, extremely powerful and ties back to a lot of what Jonathan spoke about this morning, with JavaScript and CMSs and APIs becoming extremely, extremely important and extremely very much important today. There's tons of new JavaScript stuff that's coming out, and more will keep coming out, and the focus on front end will continuously become more and more important. So now all of a sudden, you've got CMSs that are already available for you to use on the web that require no development. All you need to do is just give them off to your content team, and they can create their own data structures that they need for their particular content. They can add in their own data whenever they want without any restrictions to your own infrastructure, and it immediately creates endpoints for all the data that you could possibly need. And front-end devs are using, whether it's jQuery or whether they're using React or whether it's Angular or Vue or whatever it is that they're using, are now able to create very, very simple API requests and immediately have all of that data available for them to use. And an awesome exercise that I would recommend is to try one of those API CMSs. Just sign up for one of them. A whole bunch of them have like free tiers as well, or free options entirely. Give those a shot and try building a very, very simple front-end facing website in JavaScript that uses one of those endpoints. And you'll see how fast it is. One of the things that I absolutely love about this approach is that you are no longer required to have really, really crazy really large, really expensive infrastructures to host your content. JavaScript runs in the browser. You don't need anything bigger than like GitHub pages or a very, very small like Bluehost service to run your entire website that could be serving so much content and so many requests for however much. That was one of the biggest issues that I saw when I was working on large-scale projects on WordPress. We had to continuously increase the amount of processing power that specific WordPress apps needed, because it just wasn't able to handle the amount of data, amount of requests that were coming in continuously. Whereas if everything is front-facing, everything is just in the browser, and you've got this awesome service that is providing all that data for you through an API, it's incredibly, incredibly powerful. So the CMS industry is going to continue to grow. There's new ones popping up all over the place. Everyone is trying new things. The thing that really, really excites me about this is that more and more smaller players are trying to take a stab at this. It's no longer about the few specific, like for a while, like 3 or 4 years ago when you spoke about CMSs, everyone just mentioned Joomla, Drupal, and WordPress. That was it. Those were like the 3 things that people would say, and there were very, very few other ones that were making a huge impression. Now there's hundreds and more approaching and more coming out as the days go by. And the thing that's awesome about these smaller new CMSs is that they can try really, really new, unique things. They can try really weird things, try something out because they're very young, and utilize all the new tech that's coming out. Anyone who's been working with JavaScript or been paying attention to the industry of JavaScript knows that it's growing crazy fast. There's new stuff that's emerging constantly. There's JavaScript-focused CMSs that deliver endpoints that are then being used with React apps, and it's bananas. There's so much new stuff that's happening every single day, and it's super, super exciting. What I would recommend is that if a project comes along that requires lots of content publishing, if it's not an app, that you take a step back and have a look at all of the things that exist in the industry today. I've only spoken about just a fraction of the ones that exist. in the market and the ones that I've had a chance to use. There's so many others that I've heard are fantastic that I haven't even had a chance to use that, and I hope to explore in the future. Quite often, I find that developers are very, very opposed to using things that already exist, and they insist on building CMSs themselves. And I've experienced this at a couple past companies as well, where so much time and effort gets pushed into building a CMS that's exactly like one that already exists, that's just as fast as they need, instead of focusing on, hey, let's focus on making the front-end performance incredible. Let's spend extra time making sure that the content is incredible and the verbiage being used by our clients is A+, or the design and the UX of our website is impeccable as well. So what I would really, really like to see is people spending less time building things that already exist and focus to the other things that matter so much more, like the performance and like the user experience and accessibility and all this extra stuff that has always, unfortunately, taken a backseat. Because quite often, so much time at the beginning of a project gets spent building this CMS, and not enough time gets left over at the end for everything else. So hopefully, as more and more of these CMSs become more and more of these CMSs become a lot more powerful and a lot more obvious as like the right answer for a particular problem, a lot of that focus can shift over to some of the more immediate problems instead of working on the CMS. So look at the requirements and the needs of that particular project. You maybe don't need something super, super crazy. Maybe you're just creating a simple website. There's no mobile app. There's nowhere else that they're publishing. And something nice and simple like SiteLeaf or Webhook is more than sufficient. Maybe you need something far more complex. Maybe you need, maybe you're a newspaper and you've got your website and you've got mobile apps and you want things to show up on your, Apple Watches and a whole bunch of other wearables, then you're looking at something like an API instead. There's maybe no need to create all of that stuff in-house when so much awesome technology already exists that you can leverage. And yeah, and then determine what's the most appropriate for your particular platform and your specific project. Quite often, people really don't like to leverage tools that exist out there, and I think that's really, really silly. A lot of talented people have built those awesome platforms to solve those problems that they had themselves. So if you have those same problems, then find a solution that solves your problem. There's absolutely no reason, once again, to like insist on building one yourself just because you want to. A lot of senior devs as well who I've worked in the past are like very, very passionate about this. Like, no, they all suck. We want to make one ourselves. And it's a little bit hard to try and convince them, but like, and obviously this is not all senior devs, but like a couple every now and then. So, but like, show them how powerful something is. Give them a little demo and be like, hey, look, this has exactly what we need. We don't need to build anything from scratch. And last but not least, make Emma Watson proud. Thank you.